Hey everyone, it's time for another video. So we have just had a Q&A with Game Director Ian Hazzikostas about patch 7.1.5, mainly about all the stat changes and all the class changes, which have been really major topics in the community. So the structure of this video is simple enough. I'm going to go through all of the stuff that applies to everyone first. That includes artifact power, artifact catch-up, stat changes, 7.1.5 release date stuff. And then after that, we'll of course be going through stuff on a class-by-class basis. Right then, let's start off with the topic of classes and the overall patch cycle. So, Ian said that part of the point of these minor patches, like 7.1.5, is that they come out about 10 weeks after another more major patch. They want to fit as much into these smaller patches as they can, but if something doesn't make the cut, then it's okay for it to wait. So for the class team, that means that some classes will get attention, others won't get as much. Ian said as an example that Warlocks ended up not really fitting into this development cycle, but they will see some improvements over Legion. Now 7.1.5 for the most part is quite class change heavy, because overall it's their first course correction since Legion's launch, and of course, as many of you know, Legion really did bring a lot of very major changes to most of the classes in the game. Let's talk about the 7.1.5 release date. Simply enough, Ian just said it's not going to be before the holidays, so most likely we're looking at a January release date, which is probably close enough to the release of the Nighthold raid instance. Now then, stat changes. So, somebody asked about the breakpoint worry regarding some classes which heavily involve a particular secondary stat. As an example, crit for fire mages. Now, Ian said that overall power isn't going to be going down, and that you won't have much less of your various secondary stats than pre-patch. He said in general, their aim is a 15 item level upgrade is something that you can pretty much blindly equip. Now, Ian did say that overall power will stay the same, and perhaps even slightly increase once 7.1.5 drops, and that overall they're actually quite happy with the 7.1 balance, bar the outliers, which are the ones that obviously we've all been talking about. Now the secondary stat problem actually arose because they flattened out secondary stat progression so that you'd start off with more at the start of the expansion, but not get to insane Hellfire Citadel sort of levels. The downside of this is that the scaling of secondary stats with item level was not as large as it had been before, which really meant that it was more about what stats a bit of gear had rather than the item level of the gear itself. At least it was that in many circumstances. Now this was further exacerbated by necks and rings, because they don't actually have any primary stats to offset that effect. For the tanks, he did say that they want primary stats to play more of a role in the future, but for now, you will be getting more armor and stamina to offset the change in secondaries, because quite a lot of your tank strength really does come from their secondary stats. Overall, he said that they have buffed items by a few percent. Ian said that, for an example, an item level 890 now will be as powerful as a current 895 in patch 7.1.5, so overall a slight increase in the power. Now one thing that I would have liked Ian to break up is what it is going to be like with haste breakpoints, because for a lot of classes, you know, it's about how many of one ability you can fit into, say, a buff window. That's been a really big concern with how all these, you know, stats are working. He didn't really mention that, but that said, just get a few more bits of gear and very soon you'll be back in the position you started off with, and you will have benefited as well from the other kind of small little buffs that have happened. Let's talk about artifact power. So, artifact power hoarding is something that some people have been somewhat suggesting that you do, and just a way to game the system when patch 7.2 comes out. That's all kind of hypothetical, but he said they will not do a system which in any way rewards the hoarding of artifact power, and that all you're doing by hoarding it is giving up short-term power for actually gaining nothing at all in the future. So basically, don't hoard artifact power. It seems like it'll be a waste of time. And on the topic of artifact knowledge becoming account-wide, well, it's not happening, but 7.1.5 brings something very close. At a pretty negligible cost, you can get alts to within 5 artifact knowledge levels of your main. I'll have a full sort of showcase of that once I get a little bit more PTR stuff done, but yeah, that's pretty cool. Now then, let's talk about talents. So Ian said that looking at world-class players execute the most complex talent choice perfectly isn't always going to map onto you doing the most DPS, because sometimes, if you were to take some easier talents that are on paper, if you play perfectly, DPS loss, but if you actually in the real world are able to then execute the simple things almost perfectly, you can get better results than executing the technically optimal set of things poorly, because it's a bit harder. That's something to bear in mind with talent choices overall, and I suppose he brought that up given a lot of the discussion around talents, but that said, later on he does talk about how quite a few talent rows do need to be balanced better against each other. On the topic of stats on gear, there were some questions about Nighthold set pieces, and basically the idea that, you know, these particular secondary stats are amazing for my spec, and I look at my set and none of the bits of gear in that set from Nighthold have the stats that I want. So Ian said that things should be a little bit better because they just did a stat pass on the Nighthold gear, but he did say that they still want a mix of secondary stats for that gear so that the tier set isn't the best in slot overall, and the idea is that you've got 6 bits of set gear but only a 4 set bonus, so you want to mix and match what you have to perhaps get that 4 set bonus, but then get the optimal stats across all the bits of gear that you're going to be wearing. Now, on the topic of other types of catch-up, he did say that they might look a little bit more into there being some sort of spillover with reputation from your main. So it's the idea that you basically get a rep token that you could mail to one of your alts. That's something that they did do in the past, I believe. They, of course, did make World Quest unlocks and the Suramar dungeons account-wide, but past that, he does think that it's okay, as an example, that, you know, if you had an alt that has trade skills, he thinks it's okay that you have to still do the work on that alt to get the recipe, but it seems like they might be considering a mild catch-up mechanic somewhat. Now then, the Dalaran load screen fix has been interesting, so there's this problem that some players are having with super long, I mean minutes, Dalaran load screens. It's not affecting everyone, and the source seems to have been very hard to lock down for them. He said they're still working on it, and the customer service is working with the affected players to try to get towards a fix. They've implemented a few fixes which have helped for some players, but clearly it's not really helped for everyone, and they're still working on it. So if you have those big loading times, maybe not the most satisfactory answer, but I'm pretty sure it is something that they're looking into given the severity of the problem. Next, legendary usability. So he said they're okay with the niche legendary items that aren't always operating at their max potential. So, you know, Pirdas, whatever, Pirdas, I don't have it in front of me, I don't know how to pronounce it, but anyway, you know, that thing which will give you a haste buff whenever you interrupt an enemy, as an example. So basically he said that as people get more legendaries, this issue of some of them being super niche is less of a problem because people can pick the best legendary for the situation at hand. He did say that one overall lesson they've learnt, though, is that universally useful legendaries were a bit of a mistake because then any of the niche ones will feel super rubbish in comparison. What makes a niche item unexciting in this case isn't that the item is unexciting, it's that you know there's an alternative that you could have got which has more universal power, and they are going to be tweaking some of those legendary items with universal applicability somewhat downwards as far as their balance goes. Now, there was a bit of a talk about quality of life boosts being implemented via legendaries, and shouldn't they be baseline in some cases? Basically, Ian said that some legendaries do end up boosting quality of life because that's a new and exciting thing for a legendary to do, and part of these things being exciting means that some people would like to have them be baseline. He said that historically they've used things like set bonuses or trinkets or maybe legendaries to, in a way, test some new design things. So maybe if something is super successful, they might make it baseline in the future. But overall, it does seem like it's just mainly trying to be sort of unique, cool little design things, and they don't make things for a class that should be baseline only to remove them so they can be put on a legendary. Of course, you've got no way we can actually confirm that's what it's like, but I think I'm willing to be reasonable here and not just, you know, say that they're doing the evil thing purely for the sake of it. On the topic of legendary catch-up as well, he did say that they're going to continue to increase the drop rates across the board as more legendaries are added to the pool. Now, this seems to be a confirmation of a drop rate buff coming in patch 7.1.5, similar to the drop rate increase that came in patch 7.1. Okay, let's get on to the class-specific stuff. So, Warlocks. He said they wanted to consolidate all Warlock specs into the same resource, but he did say that there was definitely something lost there, especially with losing the granularity in the process of the building up of burning embers from the destruction spec. He said they actually want to reintroduce that for destruction, so you could basically partially recharge soul charges. And whenever I played Destro on beta, the first thing that I noticed is I don't like soul shards in this. I liked being able to build up, you know, a third of a burning ember. I thought that was a different form of gameplay that was a lot more fun than the current one, so I'm really glad that that's something that they might actually be going back to. On the topic of Demon Hunters, he did say that they are making some tweaks to make non-momentum based specs viable, and it's a goal for 7.1.5. In case you're not aware, the main viable Demon Hunter DPS build is just basically jumping about the place, which some people love, some people don't love it though, and it does present problems in some areas where, you know, you jump off a cliff or something like that, so they want a little bit more variety there, so the people who don't like the momentum-based spec can switch over to something that involves a bit less hopping about the place. Now onwards to the balanced druid, so there's been talk about the Emerald Dreamcatcher. That's basically a legendary that's very core to single target DPS for balance, and it's one that they're nerfing, which understandably has concerned a lot of balanced druids. Ian said that the nerf of the Emerald Dreamcatcher is a part of them bringing the best and the worst legendaries closer together in terms of power. He said that a spec shouldn't only feel viable with a specific item, so what they should do in that case is nerf the item and then buff the spec to compensate. Basically, that's the plan with a balanced druid. Okay, onwards to Unholy. So currently there's a lot of randomness in the spec with Festering Wounds. You generate them, you generate like 2 to 4 at once, I believe, and then you spend them. So there's a breakpoint kind of with the artifact ability where if you use it with 8 wounds on the target, it's optimal because it spawns 2 ghouls. But when your generation of that resource is kind of inconsistent and you ideally want to get 8 of it to use this ability, it can be quite clunky in terms of how it plays. Now, the reason why Festering Strikes applies a sort of a range of numbers of Festering Wounds is to maintain mechanical variation within the spec's gameplay and promote there being kind of second-to-second decisions to be made. So a fix that they're looking into for this is making Apocalypse consume 4 wounds and always spawn 2 ghouls rather than have to consume 8 wounds to spawn 2 ghouls, and then the goal there is that that will kind of alleviate the problem while still keeping the core of the spec's design intact. Next, Roll the Bones RNG. This one made Twitch chat lose their shit. So, they're not going to lower the RNG because it's against the core theme of the talent. Instead, the problem is that Slice and Dice has been so lackluster that it's not a viable alternative for players who want to use it. So, the overall plan is to make Slice and Dice something that is a bit more usable so that players have the choice. Okay then, Paladin time. So, Ian thinks that the Greater Blessing of Might is a failed design. The thought was that they could capture some of the hybrid gameplay from how the classes used to be, but they were worried about balance, so they just ended up in a really bad spot with it. If you make somebody better by being in the group, i.e. you bring a buff that you use and say one other person, that technically means, well, do you not have to do less damage to compensate for that? Now, if that isn't the case, then why just not bring all paladins to your raid and have them cross-buff each other? They ended up doing it so that the Greater Blessing of Might's buff would appear in such a way that it would be on the paladin's DPS meters, but then you're a paladin, you're thinking, well, you know, shit, I did my Greater Blessing in this target, and they're playing poorly, and I'm not getting as much damage from it as I could have. Overall, they just don't like it anymore, they think it's a failed design, and they want to scrap it and replace it with something that's new. That seems pretty good because, honestly, it seems pretty universal that people don't like that. And on to another major topic, we've got Surrender to Madness. So, Blizzard said that they want to provide a viable alternative talent to this, but so far 7.1.5 doesn't actually have anything. Basically, they tweaked things a little bit so that the regular Void form would last a little bit longer, which kind of means that Surrender to Madness was a little bit weaker in comparison. That said, Ian thinks that Surrender's a bit of a conundrum, because it's really cool, but because of that, and because of how unique it is, it's quite hard to balance. Now, he said that he doesn't see a future where, as an example, Surrender to Madness isn't the best talent in a 4-minute long fight like Ursoc, but it should be the case that on a more regular fight, you want things to be more balanced. Overall, it seems like what they want to do is make it so that in a short fight, you always want to go, kind of, towards Surrender to Madness. In most fights, though, it's a bit of a toss-up between your playstyle, and then in long fights, it's definitely, you know, it's not the best talent to go for. Now then, Storm, Earth, and Fire. I've seen a lot of unsatisfied monks talk about this. Basically, there's mechanical issues that hold it back and cause a DPS loss sometimes. They want to get all of those problems fixed in 7.1.5. He did say that if they can't, then they will tune Storm, Earth, and Fire around those bugs so that the DPS situation is okay until the bugs are actually fixed. He also said they'll be taking a look at Serenity, and overall he did seem to be just concerned with that row's balance overall, so I would say expect to see some changes on those fronts in the future, hopefully in 7.1.5. On the topic of Rune of Power, Ian says that he understands it's controversial and he thinks it's unfortunate that it's so strong versus the rest of that talent tier. It's meant to be situational for when you know there's not going to be a high movement fight, but overall right now, it pretty much is always the right choice, which is a tuning problem within that talent row. He also agrees that it's not really fun when, you know, something bad happens as soon as you drop your rune. He talked about there maybe being an underlying design concern there in the long run, but in the short term, they want to balance the rest of the row better. The idea is that if your mirror images are doing more damage, then you can feel okay not taking the Rune of Power. On the topic of Holy Paladins and player asking for more AoE and more HOTS, he said that they're not going to do that because basically the niche of Holy Paladins is super strong single target healing, and that's kind of an iconic thing for Paladins that they don't water down, and that if you want those things, there's lots of other healer specs out there, and overall he said that they're quite happy with the healer balance. And then finally, we've got my own spec, Marksmanship Hunter. He said they're mostly happy with MM on the PTR after rolling back the Sidewinder change. I'm definitely glad they rolled that back. He said aim shot is supposed to root you, that's a part of the theme, and he's okay with, the Marksmanship Hunter having to stand still. I also agree with that. I think they could even sometimes be more punishing with how much you have to stand still, because again, that kind of promotes good planning. Of course, we don't want a Rune of Power situation with Hunters, don't worry, but maybe something like that would at least be better in my head. Anyway, he also says that there is tuning to be done to make Beast Mastery and Survival more viable, but gameplay-wise, he said there were not major concerns. I don't know, I mean, from my own personal perspective, BM just doesn't seem at all fun to play because the decision-making just doesn't seem that interesting. It's, look, at the end of the day, it's a very simple spec, and that's one of the reasons why I don't enjoy playing BM. I think it's kind of hard to feel really awesome playing a spec that's kind of simple. And then as for Survival, I don't particularly like it. I've been planning on actually giving it a more comprehensive sort of second look after all the times that I played it on the beta, so maybe I disagree with him with some of the overall gameplay stuff, but I do hope that they make Beast Mastery and Survival more viable so the players who want to play those specs can actually do it in a raid. But that pretty much is it for the main contents of this video. As for my thoughts on the issue, well, consistently my line has been that I'll pass full judgment on this patch once I sort of see a more complete picture of what the changes are. And there's definitely concerns there for some classes. With a lot of these stat changes, we almost need to see how they operate in the wild in realistic gameplay conditions to be able to properly play them. However, while I do think that there might be some teething problems with these stat changes, I think it's very, very vital that they implement them pretty much as soon as they can possibly, get a good version of it out, because I really do feel that the item level problem at the minute is something that really does hurt the game. It causes social issues, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And, when you're working out those item level things, you're not playing World of Warcraft, and that kind of sucks. So that's my main thought there. As for the class stuff, I last did my full look at every spec in the game during the beta, so I'm just not really an expert on how the classes currently are all playing and how they're all doing. But what I will say is I generally like, I like his tone, I like the things that he's saying, and I hope that they're able to implement them in a way that's, pleasing to players. So, that's it for this video. Let me know what your thoughts are about the PTR, and specifically about your class down in the comments. And with that, I will see you next time.